So our next session is about program evaluation, which is evaluating your practice. And it is being presented by Dr. Dorothy Wallace. Dorothy has worked in community mental health and substance abuse treatment since beginning her social work career, with experience as both an admissions director and a case manager in nonprofit agencies. She has worked to help individuals living with substance use and mental health diagnoses seek access to affordable and available treatment. These experiences have led her to pursue research on access to mental health care, substance use intervention, substance use in rural communities, and efficacy of recovery courts, as well as program evaluation across the board, as Dorothy works on several projects currently where she is doing a variety of program evaluation. So Dorothy, the time is now yours, and we're excited to hear from you.
Thanks, Teresa. And thanks everyone for being here. I'm excited to talk to you all today about importance of program evaluation and really kind of honing in on some measurement topics. If you would have asked me when I got my MSW about 10 years ago, if I would be teaching any kind of presentation on research, I would have told you absolutely not. It was not my favorite thing. I didn't ever think that I would go back and form a career in it. So if that's what you are feeling, just know that I feel that with you. I felt that with you. Something switched for me. I don't know where and I don't know why. So I hope to make this a little bit more engaging than just your usual research talk, but I really want to talk about those kind of key program evaluations and key aspects of measurement there. So when we're talking about evaluation research, we're really talking about research that affects to assess the specific programs or policies that you're putting into place. Now, this can be on a facility-wide level, right? Say you're implementing a whole new program, working maybe in substance use, and maybe you're implementing a vouchers program. We might want to assess how that vouchers program works, but it can also be on a smaller level, right? You can assess, hey, I'm going to try a new intervention with this particular client, and I want to see whether or not this is effective. I don't think we have poll access, but just maybe a show of hands, how many people do some sort of evaluation of their practice on a regular basis? Couple folks. Great, yeah. So maybe this will give some tips and insight into doing that as well. So let me hear from you. How do you know that your program or intervention is working? What are things that you currently do right now? Chat as well. Reduction or eradication of symptoms, absolutely. Assessment of quality of life, verbal or written feedback from clients, yes, all great. Surveys, yeah, that can be a big one. Sometimes it's a combination of all these. Client reports, reduction in symptoms. So, outcome data from the state of Utah, absolutely. Feedback from teachers and parents, right? So it's a little bit of everything. You might have a standardized measure. There's definitely standardized quality of life measures that you can take into consideration to sort of do the assessment, a weekly assessment, absolutely. And knowing how people are perceiving the intervention, right? Like it is so key to hear those voices, hear the language, hear what's being said, what's being stated. Absolutely. Those are all key ways of assessing how we know our program or our intervention is working. Why evaluation? So, program evaluation is taking some of those key things that you all mentioned and putting them down, putting them into words, putting them into some sort of regular tracking, right? So program evaluation can help us determine impact of our program. We can hear a lot of things about, hey, this is working super well and going super well. But we might not have enough data or enough things without writing that down, without kind of creating that formal impact to see what the larger impact is. It can enhance service delivery. We don't want to have programs that we are putting time and money into if they're not working, right? This can come for a program that we may already have running, or it could be, hey, we want to try something new. If it doesn't work, we don't want to continue to invest time and effort into it. Evaluation allows us to assess for areas of improvement. So say you have a program that's really great at promoting reduction of substance use, right? That's where my practice area was. That's where a lot of my examples fall. But maybe it's not so great at increasing access to ancillary services. They maybe our program is supposed to be helping people with parenting classes or anger management classes, but it's really not doing any of that. So we want to see, hey, how can I enhance this here? We can implement evidence-based practices with our program evaluation. So key kind of things here are seeing what's new in our research and how we can implement it, and seeing then if that evidence-based practice works in our facility. Just because something has an evidence base doesn't mean it's going to work for every single person or every single scenario. So engaging in that program evaluation can be so key in allowing us to see, hey, these are the evidence-based practices that I want to use, and here's how they are or aren't working in my population. You can justify funding, especially on larger scales. Evaluation can really give impact into, hey, I need training for this service. I need access to these resources. And those evaluation pieces can give us concrete data to say, this is why, and this is where it will go. To engage stakeholders. If you stakeholders are in a little bit of everything, right? So they are funders, they are our clients, they are people maybe who are related to our clients who want to see that success. Having a good documented evaluation can really show our concrete next steps. And finally, to meet regulatory requirements, right? Sometimes evaluations are just required. I think somebody gave a state of Utah example. If you are doing something there, yes, there are probably just times that program evaluation is a required thing. When we took federal block grant funding for our substance use facility, we had to show concrete data that showed people had a reduction in symptoms through their time in our treatment. We did that with a few different measures that we looked at to make sure that we were able to provide the state with data that said this works. So there's a key importance for regular evaluation. If we implement something and say we give it 5 years before we evaluate it, well, there's potentially 4 years where things may or may not be going super well. If we start to evaluate on a regular basis, we can refine and change our programmatic needs to meet the needs of the clients as those are evolving. Evidence-based practice builds concrete information on what works and adds to our overall body of knowledge. And finally, accountability. Funders and stakeholders can see those key results and the impact of your program. So that's why it's really key to have that throughout practice. And then there are 2 types of evaluation research. There's formative evaluation research and summative evaluation research. So these process evaluations, these formative evaluation research are key in the early stages of program implementation. This is when you're wanting to try something new. Say there is a new evidence-based program that comes into practice. There are 3 main stages of what these look like. There is the program description, how you're going to monitor it, and how you're going to make sure that the intervention is held correctly. I was involved in one of these back in 2018. So in 2018, the state of Tennessee decided that they were going to use federal funds for a state targeted opioid response system, which brought MAT to facilities throughout the state for individuals living with opioid use disorders. We were basically told that you have to implement this program. Good luck. Right. There was not a lot of guidance. That might not be an unfamiliar scenario for some of you. And through that, we had to have a process evaluation to show that we were able to use those funds adequately. So we described what our program looked like. We were originally an abstinence only based facility. And so being told that we had to implement an MAT program was just new to how we had been conducting services. So our program, we showed what the program would look like when it was starting out, how often people would attend groups and classes on our campus. How we monitored, that was done pretty concretely in that scenario with regular urinalysis screens, but also regular mental health symptomology screens. We use things like the PHQ-9 on a regular basis. And then quality assurance. We had check-ins with the state to make sure that we were running the program how we initially said that we were going to run it. So it was very early in the stages of implementation. And again, it was done for some of those key things like those regulatory requirements and to engage additional funding sources. The next type of evaluation is an outcome evaluation, and these are done more towards the end of an intervention to see whether or not a program met its intended outcomes. So the program that we're talking about is the intervention, right? So those for us in that scenario, it was that, hey, you are going to start an MAT program, which is medically assisted treatment in your treatment center. And it was, that was our intervention. So it examines your inputs and outputs. So in our case, our resources needed for the program to operate were a doctor, a pharmacy, a group leader, an assistant to do regular monitoring, regular testing. And then the tangible results of the program that speak to the program itself. So the number of clients served, we served about 200 people throughout the course of 2 years. The number of staff trained, or something like nicotine patches distributed, right? So if you're starting a nicotine cessation program, it can be really tangible numbers. And then our outcomes are the observed changes, intended or unintended, because of the program. And that's where it's important to put in key things that you want to measure, right? So we as social workers know that there are going to be key goals. So if I'm starting an opioid use program, my key goal is reduction or cessation of illicit opioid use. But through that, what are some of my other goals could be, right? It could be improvement in relationship with family. It could be stability of a workforce. It could be improvement in relationships. There can be all sort of extra goals outside of the program. And so that's why we have to think about what our key things are that we want to measure. So components of effective program evaluation. Clear objectives. You want to make sure that you are just outright stating what it is. If it is lowered substance use, it would be lowered substance use as measured by a reduction in illicit opioid use on your analysis. Stakeholder engagement. Think of who the stakeholders at your agency might be. They can be your clients, they can be your funders, they can be your treatment team, getting people on board as well. And then data collection and analysis. These are an overview of our methods for collecting and analyzing data, emphasizing both quantitative and qualitative approaches. Quantitative are those key kind of numerical approaches, and qualitative are those approaches where we get a sense of how our clients and participants maybe felt about the intervention. And then finally, we can't forget cultural competence here. There are times where an intervention might work for one group, but not another. If an intervention is only working for the males in your program, but not the females, you might want to question why that is, and start establishing maybe some corrective approaches there. So you want to stress the importance of incorporating cultural competence in the evaluation process to ensure inclusivity and respect for diversity. We want to look and see what aspects of intersectionality might be impacted by the program. So that was just a really, really quick overview of the importance of program evaluation. And now I'm going to go into the real heart of what I want to talk about, which is using measures effectively and meaningfully. These are the things that we are going to look at to see how we know what we know, those key aspects that give us that data and give us that information. So what is measurement? Measurement in research and in practice is giving clear and concise definition to the facts, concepts, or phenomena that we aim to study. Measurement has many different facets. So in observational terms, these are things that we can see with the naked eye, right? These might be the number of people at an event. I can count how many of you are present on the Zoom today, right? That is something that is visible to all of us and can be a real key, hardy observational term. Someone's hair color, I can see that pretty easily. Easier things too, the weather. I can tell you if it's rainy or sunny outside. And then we have those kind of indirect observables. These are things that we know, but often can't tell just by our eyesight, right? So these are things like race, like income, like education, those kind of key demographic questions that you might have to ask someone to gain that information. And then here is what we often work with in our practice, what we often work with in research, are constructs. These are things that are not observable either directly or indirectly. So someone's trust in the government, how LGBTQ friendly a doctor's office is. These are not things that are going to be observable in any way unless we define them in terms that we can observe. And so that's where it comes really key into a lot of our practice scenarios and practice situations, is taking some of these harder constructs and defining them. I can change the slide. So when we think of a construct, the first part of it is a concept. So our concept is our mental image when we think of something. So when I ask you, what do you immediately envision when you think of masculinity, femininity, depression, being LGBTQ affirming? Are we all going to have the same mental image of those things? I see a couple head shaking. No, probably not. Why would we not have those same mental images of those things? I have lost my chat somewhere. For some reason, I can't read the chat. Hold on, there it is. Oh, no one's in the chat. Why would we not have the same mental image of things? Why would we not have the same mental image of depression? Socialization? Yes, absolutely. Playing out against the backdrop of personal experience, different views and experiences. Yes, they look different for different people. Culture, absolutely. All of those things give us such different mental images, right? So when I say depression, I might have a mental image in my head that looks a certain way based on my experience, maybe based on what I've seen in the media, maybe based on what I hope to see, right? It's all so different. So if I say that I'm just measuring depression, well, what do I mean by depression, right? That can be one of the key things that goes missing in a lot of our evaluation pieces. So we really want to hone in on what we mean by that. So I love this little graphic of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, apple tree, I don't remember, right? So it all depends on what you mean by chop, right? I didn't chop it, I sliced it, or I cut it down. I didn't use the word chop. So that's really the problem when we say a word without defining it. We're conceptualizing it. It's the first part, but we have to really hone in on what we mean. So when we're conceptualizing, it's writing out the clear, concise definitions of the concepts we look to study. So a lot of times in research, that can be when I want to conceptualize depression, that might mean I turn to the DSM and I look at the DSM-5 criteria for what it means to be depressed. You can look to how other people have conceptualized it in research and text. You can brainstorm, consider differences based on intersectionality, and ultimately rework your definition. But we also want to ensure that we define all terms within our definition appropriately, right? So if I say that depression includes feeling blue, well, what do I mean by feeling blue? You can really get lost in the weeds by making sure that you have all of those definitions really written out in a clear, concise way. So the key piece after conceptualization is operationalization. So this is where we spell out precisely how we are going to measure what we are studying. If I want my program to include a reduction in symptoms, what symptoms am I talking about? How am I going to measure those symptoms? And how am I going to measure it concisely? So we define things so that people know exactly what we are measuring. So an operational definition consists of three things: the variable being measured, the measure you will use, and how you plan to interpret that measure. So there are different levels that we can use when we are assessing whether or not our program has an impact on depression. Have you been diagnosed with depression? Yes or no? Have you felt depressed in the last month? Yes or no? That is a very simple way, but a valid way of measuring the operational definition of depression. You can also enhance that a little bit by adding more variables. How often do you feel depressed in a month? Never. 1 to 2 times, 1 to 2 times a week, 3 to 4 times a week, or daily. On a scale of 1 to 10, you can ask someone how depressed they feel daily. That's going to give you a count number, a real, still kind of vague number. But then you can also have something like the Beck Depression Inventory, which is a 21-item scale measuring depression with possible scores ranging from 0 to 64, with any score over 21 indicating likely clinical depression. So those are all going to be ways that you could operationalize depression. Now, what I will say is you can always make the larger, more concrete measures smaller, right? So I can use this and I could potentially narrow it down between people who scored 20 or less and people who scored 21 or more, but I couldn't take a question like this and infer something like the Beck Depression Inventory with it without doing that kind of key inventory. These are just another example. This is actually one that we are doing some program evaluations in one of my class. We are looking at agencies and their affirming practices. So we have talked about things like this with the practices that we're reaching out to. So do you have spaces on your intake form for people to write their preferred name and pronouns? Yes or no? Do you provide gender affirming care, such as writing letters for surgery and providing hormone replacement therapy for clients? Never, sometimes, frequently, or always. And then there is, again, a scale that we can use called the QUIRKS, which is the Querying Individual and Relational Knowledge Scale for Providers, which is a 24-item scale that includes environmental cues, knowledge, clinical preparedness, clinical behaviors, and attitudes. So you can see here, again, there's just different ways to operationalize, and you can create those definitions based on what makes sense for you and your evaluative practice. So ineffective operational definitions are, again, poorly defined, often lacking the concise aspects. So for example, how would you rate this client's substance use? Less than average, average, more than average? Well, what's average substance use? Are we all going to have the same definition of average substance use? Not necessarily. We can make this better by adding things like, I believe it's the CDC recommendations for what is considered binge drinking, what is not considered binge drinking, what different drinks per different days look like, right? But if we just say something like less than average, average, or more than average, it's not really honing in on what we're getting to. I have an example of this that I have seen before, which is average volunteer hours. Well, what's an average number of volunteer hours? If you're just asking that of people who are incoming potential volunteers, right? Where they've volunteered before. That's going to vary so greatly. So what do we mean by average? What's the number that we're looking for here would really help us define that. So this is the kind of thing that you want to make sure that you are kind of avoiding not being able to spell out these kind of key things here and making your measurements less meaningful than they potentially could be. So how do we know that measures are good, right? So when we're talking about scales, when we're talking about things like the Beck Depression Inventory, the PHQ, things that you might have heard of before or used before, maybe use every day, how do we know that they're good measures? So there's two kind of things that we're looking for here, and that's reliability and validity. Reliability means that it measures the same thing the same way every time. And then validity is accuracy. So it accurately measures your underlying construct and truly gets at what it is, what you're trying to measure. So you can have a scale that's reliable but not valid. You can have a scale that is valid but not reliable. And then you can have one that is neither. But ideally, we're looking for something that is both valid and reliable. Yeah, great. You looking for average substance use? Yes, Samuel, that's such a great here. That would absolutely enhance that definition, right? Where we're looking for um what the DSM states. That's absolutely where we turn. It gives us kind of key things there. So you can spend your whole life developing measures. There are people that do spend their whole life developing measures. I've met them. I'm thankful for them. That's not me, but we want to keep an idea of what we're looking for here. So there are different types of reliability. So when you're looking up a measure, you just kind of want to look for these kind of key terms and what they say. So there's that test, retest reliability. That means the measure yields the same results when it's given multiple times. So I've developed a new scale on depression. It's the best one yet, in my opinion. And when I give it to the same groups of people, they get the same or similar scores spread out across a few weeks. Then you have inter-rater reliability. That means that when you and another person are taking it, you are getting the same observations of what you're seeing occur. And then there's internal consistency reliability, which is probably what you see most common with scales. It basically that each item on a scale relates to each other and the underlying construct. So when you're looking for those kind of scales and opportunities, those scales and measurements, these are the kind of things that you want to look for when you're assessing reliability. And I'm not going to go into all of these types of validity, but these are the things that building upon each other are going to be really key to make sure your scale is valid. So the most basic type of validity is face validity, which means that looking at it, it seems to measure what I think it should measure. And then you get more into convergent validity and discriminant validity, which is how the items in your measure kind of correlate to other constructs or not correlate with a different construct that's being measured. So there's not always going to be a quantitative scale or a qualitative or a quantitative measure that's been developed. And sometimes we might want to assess things by talking to people, getting their sense of what worked, what did not work, kind of going into those kind of key things there. So you want to really look at trustworthiness when you are talking about kind of qualitative measures, talking about people's experiences with a program or intervention. So the truth, applicability, consistency, and neutrality are going to be key things that you're looking for there. And then authenticity. So there should never just be one person developing the authenticity and experiences of a group of people's experiences, right? It should at least have two sets of eyes so that people can agree on what the kind of key themes and key topics being discussed are. So when we're talking about our kind of key variables, when we're creating measures or using measures, our variables are our grouping of characteristics, and then our attributes are the characteristics that make up that variable. So for example, again, depression can be our variable, and attributes can be feeling down, loss of interest in activities, isolation. Again, I like Samuel's example of the DSM. They kind of give us those key things if we use the DSM criteria to operationalize some of these things. So with substance use severity, you've got different criteria. And so your variable would be substance abuse, and your attributes would be those DSM criteria that indicate a substance use disorder, and then the severity of that. So the DSM is a really great tool to break down those operationalizations in practice. When we're talking about levels of measurement, you've got binary, which is just those key two categories, nominal, which is 3 or more categories, but there's no numerical meaning between those categories, right? Like there's no way that I can define the numerical meaning between Democrat, Republican, Independent. Those are kind of those often demographic questions that we ask where there's no number that can be associated between those categories. Ordinal, there can be, right? So these are things that we think of as Likert scales. So strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, strongly agree. There are numerical meanings between those categories, but it's really vague. Intervals are attributes that are numerical, but there's no true zero. This is often used on a lot of scales. And then ratio is the next step, which is similar to intervals, but there is a true 0 point. So it is possible to have 0 levels of depression. It is possible to have 0 levels of anxiety. It is possible to have 0 levels of substance use. So a lot of the scales that are developed for measurements that we use in social science and social work are going to be at that kind of key ratio level. And a note when you're creating these about all levels of measurement, they must be mutually exclusive and exhaustive, meaning that this first example is not a great way to measure income, because what if you make $50,000? Do you put yourself in category 3 or category 4? You might have some misinterpretation of data there. So measurement is not without error. It is impossible to be perfect. Even in measurement and even in research, you can have systematic error, which is where you introduce bias in some way. And then random error is that predictable, unpredictable error that does not bias data, but can still be a real problem. These are going to be things, the types of things that bias our results and can bias potentially our evaluation, our leading questions. So didn't you think that this was a great intervention? Didn't this reduce your symptoms of depression? Things like that are going to have people kind of seeing how we want them to answer that question and potentially answering in the way that we want them to, as opposed to what actually happened. Similarly, we might have some of that with social desirability bias with our clients, right? They want to come across positively instead of answering truthfully. So yeah, this did work great for me, but maybe they're not showing that kind of key symptom reduction, right? That's where it can be really beneficial to kind of take yourself out of it and use some of these scales. And then acquiescent bias is somebody that just doesn't want to take the time to fill it out and answers across a survey. I saw this a lot in one of our program evaluations for our substance use. It was a really long, like 35 item about all different kinds of aspects of how substance use had impacted life. And like 5 of those items were reverse scored, right? Well, I could see where people would go through and just write 3 all the way, or 4 all the way down, or 5 all the way down at the end of their treatment, wanting to say like, yes, this treatment program was great. I really benefited from our groups and classes that we did. And then you would do the scoring and be like, oh, well, if they scored 5 here and that was really accurate for them, then they should have put a 1 here, but instead they just went through and bubbled the same things all the way down. So those are kind of the key ways that you might potentially have some issues there. So my last kind of key thing that I want to talk about here, and I'm going to end the slideshow, is that you don't have to create measures on your own. I have way too many screens up. Let's see. So you can use these open access sources. I especially love PROMIS. Has anyone used PROMIS measures before? Am I sharing my screen? Let's see. Okay, so PROMIS, this is through NIH, and it kind of gives you the almost anything that you could need kind of in social science world. So you can look here to obtain and administer measures. You can find out more information about how they were developed. So basically everything that I was talking about really kind of key. This gives you a good database about those measures here. Let's see. You can find so many things here. So they've got different categories. So mental health, physical health, social health, and then other. And you can look here for a lot of things that might be beneficial for program evaluation, right? So ability to participate in a program. Oh my goodness, if this mouse will work. You can find ability to participate related to social functioning, ability to participate in social roles, but then also a lot of times there will be shorter ones. So if it says 4, that means the 8 item has been shortened to 4 items here. So you can pull up different open access measures there. You again, anger, irritabilities, the sort of same thing here. And you can go kind of click on these and it'll show you the age range for a lot of them. So the NIH toolbox for anger and aggression. Oh, let's see. Put your email address in here and then you get the whole PDF. So you can get how they're created and scored. And then often there will be sort of key scoring things here, and then other kind of key information about how these measures were developed. So they're really helpful for program evaluation, single subject design. They're used in research a lot. They're just a great open access resource for a lot of what you could be interested in seeing if your new program or your current program impacts. So that is the first one. The other is the open access research database. It's going to be a little, I like it. It's a little less helpful than the PROMIS database because you have to kind of go into, read kind of the data and everything about that there, and then assess what has been created. So you can look up a certain variable and see what studies are available there. So again, still helpful, but I love the promise ones and how straightforward they are. And then the CDC also has other open evaluation resources. So you can get kind of these key open access information on best ways to evaluate, what you want to learn from evaluation, addressing concerns, right, time, technical demands, those kind of key things there. Let me see what's in the chat. Yeah, I could absolutely place the link in the chat. So, and then they are in the slides too, which you will have access to, but, yes, I wanted to make sure that I was telling you all about the frustrating part about research, which, is that, as you know, there is the gap between research and practice. So once you leave a university, unless your agency pays for access to databases, it can be hard to access. So wanted to make sure that I included some of these open access for you all, as we're really talking about, because you don't have to develop measures. I personally don't want to spend time to develop and measure on depression when I have so many out there available for me. So those are kind of those key things there. All right, I think I talk fast, so I'm done a little early. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I know I talk fast. I get that feedback a lot, but I haven't been able to slow it down yet. So happy to stick around and answer any questions or give y'all a little bit longer break on this Friday afternoon.
Dorothy, I have a question.
Oh.
Since a lot of folks are doing like their own data collection,
Mhm.
do you have like tips to maybe encourage getting to the analysis part? I think that might be like a gap of like we're getting all this information, but we're not sure where to go for
Mm.
analysis or for like even starting that.
That's a great question. I think the analysis piece can be something that can be uh hard to do. I know that there are open access resources, like if you happen to love programming, R is a great resource on doing the analysis. But one of the first steps analysis is visually plotting things, right? So maybe you're testing a new intervention with the client. Maybe you plot their scores on the Beck Depression Inventory on week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, and then just sort that into a graph, right? That can be a first kind of key step in analysis and seeing like, hey, this graph shows a decrease here, or this overall graph shows a trend downwards, or actually it's trending upwards, and we were really hoping that this would lower these symptoms. So that would be my advice for kind of that key first steps in doing that analysis piece. And that's a great question, Teresa. I'm happy to think on it longer. I happen to have gone off the deep end, and I love statistics, so I'm happy to talk about the weeds of statistics if anyone's interested in that at any point. Yeah, that probably didn't answer your question thoroughly, but I wish I had a better one.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I'll ask another follow-up question, partially because I am more familiar with program evaluation. But as far as like maybe smaller organizations that don't have access to like statistical analysis programming, and they still want to do they're like, oh, we got all these numbers together. What's one of the most effective ways for them to start analyzing maybe quantitative data?
I would say still probably Excel or R if you're going to do it cost effectively. However, that can also be a key piece to apply for small grants for, right? Just kind of those, and I know that all of this takes time, but applying for some of those small grants can be beneficial in kind of helping that as well. I will say, I am a big proponent of using artificial intelligence as a tool. You can put stuff into Excel and then upload that into ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT to summarize it for you. That's been something, it's not perfect, but it can be something that gets a head start. So that's something that I've seen before, and it's using kind of that AI as a tool. Um, there's also another program that does cost a little bit of money, but I will have to get back to Teresa and give y'all the name to it. But it can be really, you can put your data in there from Excel, and then it kind of analyzes it for you. But I blanked on the name.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
We do have a question in the chat. Would you suggest tracking individual client responses or progress through a group to know if it's truly effective? When I tend to track progress, I just track how many people mark different answers and responses to questions like strongly agree, neutral, etc. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So I think that you can do two things, right? So if you're looking at a whole group, you can look at how clients that were in that group potentially had changes throughout, individual changes, but then you can look at the overall change for the group, right? So you could usually a kind of key thing that you could do is maybe do strongly disagree as 1, to strongly agree as 4, and you can assign numbers to those, and then kind of sum that up and see the differences throughout the group's total score throughout. And then if you have those for the individuals as well, then you can look at those kind of individual differences. Yeah.
All right, are there any other questions? All right, well, Dorothy can hang on for a minute and answer any questions that come to mind. But we will then take a longer break before our next session, which is our suicide prevention. So if you want to come back at 4 o'clock, that'll be just under 15 minutes. Thank you, Dorothy.
Yeah, thank you all.
We've got another question in the chat for you, Dorothy. Do you ever review people's measurements for groups and such, and then provide feedback to them?
I have actually not done that yet, but I would absolutely be happy to. That's something that we can definitely talk about with our Transforming Communities Institute as being a practice. So I would absolutely, if you want to send me an email, I would absolutely be happy to review that.
Yeah, I'll put her email in the chat.
And then some standardized measures require special training. Usually the ones I would say the clearest way is the ones that require special training usually cost a lot of money. So some of those that are going to have more of that training will cost money, whereas there are some that I would say things that you have probably heard of and probably even use, like the PHQ-9, the Beck Depression Inventory, kind of those key proxy diagnostics can be really something that everyone can use. I know I used them when I was an intern, similar to the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. But I would say if it's open access, it's going to be more something that is feasible for anyone and doesn't kind of require that special training. Yeah, no problem.
Kira, if you do end up reaching out to Dorothy, like she said, the Transforming Communities Institute helps facilitate some of those interactions. And so as we're expanding, there may be more opportunity for other folks to reach out for program evaluation needs.
Yes, absolutely. And we love to partner with community partners in our social work classes. So if you have an idea where you're like, hey, I think that I would like to have this evaluated, I have about 100 somewhat willing students because they want to make a grade that would be happy to look at things and look at that evaluation piece as well. So absolutely, please reach out. Yeah, that's awesome. Absolutely.
Okay, well, it looks like we might not have any other questions, Dorothy. So if you want to, you can stay. If not, I don't know if you're hanging out for Jan's session or and what have you, but thank you so much.